Discussing climate change is hard. No one likes hearing bad news. And taking the necessary steps to avoid the worst effects of rising temperatures due to emissions is infinitely harder. There is no silver bullet, no solution that will satisfy everyone. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. So let's take a look at the difficult decisions facing the global community and the ambitious measures discussed at this year's COP30 conference in Belém, Brazil. And helping us along, we welcome back Liangyi Chang, a climate activist and a sustainability consultant, and Nate Maynard, an environmental consultant and currently the Director of Strategy for Sustainability at Red Peak. Both are speaking to us from Taipei. Liangyi, climate action obviously doesn't come for free. Do you think there's enough money behind these goals, these ambitions, both in Taiwan and globally?
I think in Taiwan it's very hard to maintain the voices. Just right after the pandemic, I think people have a lot of events to attend. So really how to drag the eyeball and attention, that's what I usually say is about the intention economy now. So how can we really translate those narratives and also stories telling, for example, like how I, from a medical science background, change into a climate activist now. So tell the story from your personal story, how you make the actions. I think now it's the leeway already everywhere in Taiwan. But I think the more is that how to deep dive into those solutions now, like how to make the renewable works, how we can change the fossil fuels, for example, now still 80% from Taiwan's energy, electricity sources to 100% renewable. How to talk about that? It's really also hard. It's not just really very sad story, like the climate kid, getting serious for the past 5 years for a more stronger typhoon, but also how we find a solution, right? So I really like one of the young people share one story to me is that he said that, well, let's find that people share the interest, to find the shared curiosity among the people. So that's always I got inspired from the civil society movement outside of Taiwan also. I'm being inspired by the Vietnamese lady, she inspired me to keep doing the climate action. She said, hey, Liangyi, you should do the same thing with me, even go to Antarctica, to see the, sea level rising and also the melting sea level, then keep doing that and also keep the work and to trust the civil society movement. I think the spirit, the value that we cherish will continue to go on.
I'm glad to hear that, and values and enthusiasm are important to keep up, but there are specific amounts being discussed at the COP30 conference. Actually, at last year's COP in Baku, parties agreed that developed nations will take the lead in wrangling up $300 billion per year by 2035 to support climate action and mitigation of the worst effects of climate change in developing countries. What was also said is that all countries, in quotes, all actors, are to work together to unlock at least 1.3 trillion US dollars by the same time annually from public and private sources to flow to developing nations. And this intuitively feels like a lot of money. But given the scope of the challenge, do you feel that this is more of a watershed moment or a drop in the bucket?
That's a good question. I mean, if we think about how much society is willing to spend, I'm pretty sure OpenAI just a few days ago or sometime earlier this week is asking for a $1 trillion backstop from the US government on its investments. So clearly we have money to invest in new AI data centers. The money is there. So it's just a question of choice as to whether or not we want to put it into climate. And I also want to underline, because I feel like when we talk about climate finance, we act like the money goes into a big pit and is just burned. But this is money going to some of the most vulnerable people and communities in the world who, once they have this new infrastructure and once they have, cleaner, safer neighborhoods with cleaner air, those economic impacts are going to come back in multiple. There's a lot of research that's been done by the World Resources Institute, WRI, on climate adaptation investments. So this isn't ideal, but this is the investments that's required to adapt to climate change. They found that on the low end, for every dollar you invest, you get $2 back. And on the higher end, you can get $16 for every dollar you invest. So these climate loss and damages funds and helping lower income countries adapt to climate change, this could be a way of growing more economic growth in these places. So, do we have the money? We definitely do. Do we want to spend it in that way? Well, that's obviously what we're arguing about in Belém.
It's ironic that those data centers that are so costly also contribute so much to the problem that we're discussing today. But Nate, I want to stay on this topic a little longer. Critics point out that the $300 billion goal is largely achievable with current pledges, with amounts that were currently promised by governments, and the rest will likely be offset by inflation, which this projection also doesn't account for, shockingly. And also, none of this is legally binding. Do you expect, or should we expect and ask the delegates, ask our leaders to contribute more to climate action?
I think we should be asking our leaders to contribute more for climate action, especially, I'm an American and the U.S. has obviously pulled out of COP and the current administration has pulled funding from the UN. And my understanding is that there's more than a $1 billion shortfall. So obviously when these, proposals were designed, I think there was some assumption about, the U.S., one of the world's largest emitters, to continue to fund these things. I don't think that we should assume that they will be funded, but I think that we should be ambitious. And let's remind ourselves that this is the greatest challenge or transition that humans have ever experienced. Our entire society is dominated by the invention of fossil fuels. It's not going to be cheap or easy to change the system, but the benefits on the other side are going to be enormous. We have plenty of preliminary data to show that. So the investment is worth it, and we need to continue to call for action on climate.
Well, since you mentioned that, another item on the agenda at this year's COP is transitioning away from fossil fuels, but only around a third of NDCs submitted by October included clear language on transitioning or phasing out fossil fuels. In fact, some countries, including Russia, Nigeria, and Morocco, committed to using more natural gas. So, Liangyi, why do you think this change is so slow? And how is this transition away from fossil fuels looking like in Taiwan, especially natural gas, given how Taiwan needs it to power itself?
Yeah, I always say that I'm being asked by, it's a really good question for, talking about LNG, because the gas is being seen as a transition energy sources. But I always say to the people saying that, well, I've been starting the anti-coal movements, anti-air pollution movements, I think it was 2010 or sometimes 10 years ago. I don't want to start another anti-gas movement after 10 years. Because if you look at economic-wise, like the money you invest in to build a gas LNG container, it takes like 30 or 40 years, to make it, balanced. So I would say that if I can make a better choice, I would definitely invest in renewable, like geothermal, try something new, don't play all the eggs into one basket, right? And also globally, Taiwan play a key role in semiconductor. All of the chips are made from here and designed by here. I will challenge the industry saying like, how can we make it financially reform and investing when we think about that in the global industry? Or now it's like all the countries having their own challenge now, given the political power polarized, as Nate mentioned about the US situation. So I think we need to change our mindset, change our brain, thinking as a US, okay, what do they thinking about now? Like, where do they invest their money? How to make their profit in their country, and also how they spend their money for climate change. So I think also to Taiwan is different cases, to different countries, different cases.
Well, if we're pushing for change, we have to know where we're starting from. So where is Taiwan at right now? What are the current policies that are in place? aimed to limit or reduce reliance on greenhouse gases or fossil fuels that generate greenhouse gases?
So now I think we already have the wind and solar meeting the gigawatts, but it's not enough. So I think the law of the Climate Change Response Act at this moment passed in 2023 for the target of 2030 target for lowering down of 28% compared to 2005, which is definitely hard to meet already. So how can we bring more sectors to build more renewable? Like I always talk to my parents, like, can we build a solar panel on the rooftop? And neighbors, like, can we form an association to educate them to put a solar panel? I think that's really, really important for get the hands on. That's everywhere, not just Taiwan. I heard from developing countries, from Vietnam, from Philippines, from Indonesia, and also Japan. I think everyone is looking for solutions. I think that's the same as Nick said, like it's a global challenge. And we're actually pretty on the same page for just transition. It's not easy.
Well, it is not. And as you say, it is a global challenge where we see interlocking and interconnected economies. And Nate, you mentioned that briefly already, but the world's biggest economy, the United States, is pulling out of international climate agreements. It's scaling back or gutting its own environmental agencies and environmental programs. It's also pressuring its partners and allies to decrease reliance on green energy and go back to fossil fuels. What do you think the impact of that will be beyond the United States itself, or the impact on the global community?
I would be very surprised if any other country is going to listen to the US about what it thinks about energy policy going forward for green energy. And fortunately, kind of building on what Liangyi was saying about gas, it takes 30 years for these gas plants to kind of capitalize on their value. We now are experiencing a true revolution with wind, solar, and batteries. The prices have never been lower. In our lifetime, the price of batteries has decreased more than 90%, and it's continuing to decrease. That is going to change the way we do energy storage. Combine that with solar prices, which continue to decrease. So we fortunately have physics on our side. If you look at a new report from Ember called the Electrotech Revolution, they talk about how we may have already reached peak fossil fuels for electricity primary demand. We still need a significant amount of fossil fuels for heating and industrial purposes, but in terms of electricity usage, we're no longer bound and required to use the single-use batteries of barrels of oil or, meters cubed of gas to power our societies. Is the U.S. going to have much of an influence? It really seems like China is the one driving the bus right now. They're generating, most of the world's renewables. They're generating most of the world's electric vehicles and batteries. So if you're a country that's trying to develop and build a grid quickly, you're probably not going to look at the U.S. For very much support. And in some ways, maybe it's a good thing that the U.S. isn't in COP negotiations at the moment. Just because you're a heavy fossil fuel emitter doesn't mean that you're going to leave COP, right? Saudi Arabia, Russia, there's plenty of countries that are inside of COP negotiating who use lots of fossil fuels and try and slow down the negotiations. Maybe it's better that the U.S. is sitting it out this time.
Well, Liangyi, Taiwan likes to call itself Technology Island, and with good reasons. Very advanced high-tech industries, the semiconductor industry, all very energy hungry. But that also creates a certain degree of techno-optimism here. People tend to like technology and trust technology. Do you feel, and I know, and as Nate mentioned, that there have been fantastic technological advances in green energy generation. But do you feel that we are maybe relying a little too much on future technologies, on what might come in 5 to 10 years, and in doing so, maybe kicking the can down the road a little bit instead of relying on what's here now to set our goals?
I think the answer is very easy to say yes. I think people are they're very lazy. So we rely on the electricity, now rely on technology, AI every day now. So it's really different from our previous generation. So how to make creative solutions to find the money. I think that's the way out. So for example, like we mentioned about, oh, maybe the global north countries not here for the conversation. So how can we work together? For example, there are impact investments, blended finance, new investing tools that we can look at. How Taiwan's strong, SMEs can really looking for ways for not just the big giants technology, but also like, small technology that can also create a green solution for community, which I do see like getting more and more solutions oriented. Because nowadays, when you talk with the younger generations, Gen Z, they will definitely love the great stuff. Like you need to make a better chance for the world, right? So if you don't do any chance, I don't want to join your company. I want to apply for a job like without doing any meaning for good for the world. So I do see the morale power getting more and more stronger here in Taiwan. That's how I do see that grab the chance, even though the world is getting hotter. And then, the geopolitical power is very hard to really manage and balancing. But yeah, that's how we live with it every day,
This conversation has been a very informative, but a mix of, good and bad, of optimistic and pessimistic stuff. But I do want to end on a positive note, something that gives that will give our viewers a bit of optimism. Nate, what is, in your opinion, the best case outcome of the COP30 conference and international commitments? What would you like to see?
What I'm afraid of is what I heard at Climate Week in New York, which is that countries are not going to be putting forward ambitious amounts of funding and ambitious amounts of climate goals. So my hope, and I think a good outcome, would be reinvigoration of climate action. And it's that bigger countries we haven't expected to see before, like Brazil, Mexico, the global south, taking more of a lead in climate negotiations. And I think that would be a really happy outcome for me. I don't think anyone is expecting, given the current geopolitical crisis, everything that's going on, I don't think we're expecting this COP to be the one where we finally get it. But if this is the one where the global community comes together and really takes climate action seriously, I would say, great. That's a success.
Liangyi, same question to you. What is, in your opinion, the best case scenario, best outcome that we could maybe expect, that we could hope for from this year's COP?
I think there are two, So I do hear that from Baku to Belém, the gender agenda kind of to push forward, and also the multilateral of the human rights. And as we said already, in the indigenous people's rights on the community, these two agendas might be really strong for the outcome for the COP30. But also in the long term, I do see, as Taiwan is not part of the UN, when we hear about, oh, there's a UN conference, and everyone is like, oh, I want to join that. But I think now US is not part of that. And as you heard about the UN 2.0 process and then relocating to Africa region. So I think that's a good chance for Taiwanese to think about how the global spaces and where are we going for the global spaces as contribution. Maybe COP is not the only one. Maybe other global venue as the New York Climate Week or Asia, there's many new, like the Climate Week organizers can be the venue for us. Or maybe we can lead one space for the global conversation on climate action.
Let's hope. I mean, I do like the optimism and the hopefulness there in both your answers. Thank you so much, Liangyi Chang and Nate Maynard, for joining us from Taipei.